Okay, great. Thank you, Perry. I appreciate it. And welcome, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to chat with you today. As Perry said, Joanne and I work for a company called Advocacy Solutions, and we essentially teach and train people how to be effective advocates on their own behalf. So what we're going to do for the next little bit is give you essentially an introduction to advocacy, and then hopefully it will give you some idea of the kind of engagement that we do in our work and in working with organizations like Jesse's Journey and others. So here's the agenda. This is what we're going to talk to you about today. We're going to go through this relatively quickly. This is in its entirety about a 2+ hour presentation. We're not going to give you a 2+ hour presentation, as I said, but we're going to skim the surface here. So if there's a lot of content that you feel we don't cover, or if you have questions about it, we're here all day. We're happy to chat with you and answer any questions that you may have. So we'll just, you can read this. I'm not going to go through it with you, so why don't we just sort of jump right into it. So let's start at the beginning. What is advocacy? Well, it's verbal support or argument for a cause or a policy. That's a dictionary definition that I'm not particularly fond of, so we've come up with another definition that I think is a little bit easier to understand. It's really just telling your story to someone, and that someone could be anybody. It could be government, it could be a physician, it could be a hospital administrator, it could be a teacher, an employer, through various means with the express purpose of compelling them to do, or in some cases, not to do something. It's about action. It's about compelling somebody to take action. And these people that we talk about are what we call targets or decision makers. And it's simply the person who has the thing that you need. So if you're advocating to somebody, you need to make sure you're advocating to the right person, the person who has the thing that you need. Advocacy is a process that normally takes time to realize tangible results. This is a really, really important point. Advocacy is not a moment in time. It's not a single effort. It's not one letter. It's not one meeting. It's a process that you have to engage in. And sometimes it takes a long time to make the change that you're trying to make. There's no one way to do it. It's very personal to your own style or your own comfort level. You don't need to be a certain kind of person to do this. You just need to know how to do it, and that's what we help people understand. And then finally, it's about empowerment. It's exerting some form of control and initiating some form of action around an issue that matters to you. And perhaps more than anything, that's often what will draw people to engage in advocacy, this ability to be empowered to make change. Thank you. So why is advocacy important? Well, if you remember nothing, you simply need to remember this. Because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's life, if you haven't figured it out. That's government, that's politics, that's any large institutional setting you may have ever found yourself working in or part of. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Say nothing, nothing will change. Say something, and something may just change. It's also important because particularly if you're advocating to government, you need to make yourself heard. And I will often give the example that I used to work in government at one time. If I have 100 files on my desk, which is not an exaggeration, the files on the top are always exactly the same. I don't even need to know what the issue is or what the ministry is. It's not relevant. They're on the top because people are calling, they're tweeting, they're demanding change. That's why they're on the top. The files at the bottom are at the bottom because I can assure you nobody's calling, nobody's tweeting, and nobody cares if I ever pick up the file. And so what I tell people is, when I worked in government, guess when I picked up file number 100? Never. There was nothing compelling me to pick it up. If I worked in government for 10,000 years, I would never pick up file number 100 because there's nothing compelling me to pick it up. You want to get to the top of the pile, and you get to the top of the pile by, in very simple terms, making noise, advocating for the change that you require. Now that's the example with government, but it doesn't matter whether it's government or any other target. The process is exactly the same. Different kinds of advocacy. This is a slide that we put up because it's a slide that many of you may be able to identify with. For people who are new to the world of advocacy, it's often personal need that will compel you to take action. In fact, it's almost always personal need that will compel you to take action. You're not looking to change the world, you're just looking to help yourself or a loved one. But it's out of this personal need that some people start to realize that they have an opportunity to bring about what we call larger public policy change by advocating for broadly based issues. And the people that do that, we describe them as having graduated. You graduate from seeing the world and the issues that you're facing as only about you and your immediate surroundings and needs to something bigger. In other words, you enter into, for example, the healthcare system, and you are taking a journey through the healthcare system, and you realize there are challenges. You may have never thought of it this way, but you have two choices. You can either travel through this journey alone, trying to resolve your problems, which is a perfectly normal, sensible approach, or you can pause and say, well, wait a minute. If we're having these challenges, it means other people must be having these challenges. And if other people are having these challenges, what if we could help not just ourselves, but everybody? And when you flip into that mindset, you've graduated from seeing the world just about yourself and the immediate issue and something bigger. You've shifted from what we call personal advocacy to issue-based advocacy. It doesn't mean you don't still do personal advocacy, but it means that you see something bigger than just yourself. And that's exciting because that's how real change can occur. The essence of good advocacy, this is the foundation. If any one of these elements is missing, you're going to have a difficult time starting to engage in advocacy, let alone get better at it. And in the fuller presentation that I mentioned, we go through each one of these points in some detail. We're not going to do that today. But I do want to have a quick discussion about what we call the two cornerstone pieces of advocacy: personal stories and relationships, specifically relationships with those decision makers or targets I talked about a moment ago. So let's talk about personal stories first. In a face-to-face meeting or in a written communication with a decision maker, your personal story makes your issue come to life. It is critical to be able to tell your personal story either verbally or in written form to a decision maker. It's critical because it makes the issue real for the person that you're advocating to. And it provides what we call a point of connection between the two of you. You're trying to connect with the person to whom you are advocating. If properly developed and delivered, your personal story should also fuel the logic of your ask. And Joanne's going to talk about what an ask is, but essentially it's what you're asking the person to do for you. And the other thing I want to be clear about is that a personal story is your personal story. It's not meant to be objective. It's very subjective. It's about you or it's about your family. And it's also meant to be emotional. Now understand what I mean when I say it's meant to be emotional, or it can be emotional or should be emotional. Emotional doesn't mean sad. That's what a lot of people think. Well, if I tell my story, it's going to be sad. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the range of emotions that all of us as human beings experience every day, every week, throughout our lives. I'm just suggesting to you that when you tell your personal story, you need to ensure that it's infused with the emotion that you and your family have experienced along the way of your journey. All of the emotions, everything. From happy to sad to angry to frustrated to elated and everything in between. And so it's very important to remember that that's the approach that you need to take. In terms of how to tell your personal story, as I mentioned, your ability to tell it is the key to your success, particularly when advocating in person. When you are advocating in person, that's when you can have a dramatic impact on the person to whom you're advocating by delivering this personal story. And while I don't have time in the presentation to answer all of the questions that are on the slide, let me just review some of the more critical elements related to personal stories. In your personal story, you've got really two choices. And let me just sort of review with you what they are. You can either tell a summary of your entire personal story. By the way, sometimes or oftentimes, or typically, in a face-to-face meeting, you've got 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes if you're really lucky, so it's not a lot of time. So in those few minutes that you have, you've got two choices. You can either tell an entire summary of your personal story in that brief period of time, and it's possible, it takes a lot of work, it's tough, but you can do it. Or you tell a portion of your story, often focusing on one or two key aspects. The example I'll often give is, I'm going to tell you my personal story quickly, but I'm really going to focus on when I was diagnosed. That's going to be the focal point of what I'm going to tell you about in my personal story. It doesn't mean that the rest of the personal story isn't important, but for this purpose or for this moment, you focus on a particular part of your personal story. I'm not sure how many of you have ever written out your personal stories, but you really need to do so if you're going to be an effective advocate, and it's essential. It's essential that you do this for a number of reasons. Number one, because we all forget things as life goes on. It's, of course, an ongoing story that you can add to. The day that you write out your personal story, you've written everything that's happened, but you haven't written what is to come that's going to happen or that's going to come. So you have to always be updating your personal story, but at least you've captured what's happened in the past. And as I just mentioned, you're going to need to create versions of your personal story. There's going to be opportunities where you're going to want to tell different versions or focus on different elements or components of your personal story. And when you've written the whole thing out, it's almost like chapters in a book. You can go to that section and you can say, well, I'm going to pull out that piece around diagnosis, for example, or whatever it may be. The other thing that we're often asked is, when you're in a face-to-face meeting, it's getting a bit granular, but it's an important point. Can I read it? Can I read my personal story? Oftentimes people will say, well, I don't want to read it because I want to look like, I want to present well and all the rest of it. You can read it, that's fine. You don't have to read it, but if you want to read it, that's okay. The one thing you have to remember, and this is one of the things that makes personal stories such an exciting part of advocacy from our perspective, your personal story is unassailable. Nobody can argue with your personal story. I'm a lawyer, so I can argue with anybody about everything. But I don't argue with people about their personal stories. Because what am I going to argue about? What am I going to say? I'm not the expert. I don't know your personal story the way you know it. When you articulate a personal story well, it's unassailable. It's bulletproof. Nobody can argue with it, and that's powerful. In the world of advocacy, I cannot emphasize enough how powerful it is to have a component, an element of your work that is unassailable, and that's why personal stories are so critically important. Okay, and here are some of the kind of 4 elements that every personal story should have in it, certainly for the purposes of advocacy. The first 2 are pretty straightforward. Basic, excuse me, basic personal details and facts about your personal situation, or what we call background, if you will. You have to set the stage. So I'm a decision maker. You come in, you sit down, you meet with me. I don't know you. We've never met before. Let's assume that's the case. You have to set the stage for me. So you do that primarily through your basic personal details and facts about your personal situation. Your key messages will be, when you do your key messages as well, they'll be included in the issue part, the issue that you're dealing with. Your key messages will also be potentially woven into the work that you're doing there. We're going to talk about key messages in a moment. At every point, as I said a moment ago, you need to convey your feelings. You need to infuse it with how you felt. Now, I want to draw another really important point here, draw upon an important point here, particularly in a situation like this, where we have families. Your personal story is your story. So parents, it's your story. Now, your story will include the story of your family, more broadly speaking, and that's fine. But really, I want to hear your story. So a personal story is one that includes the word I, or the words I, me, my, I felt like this. Don't tell me a personal story about how your son felt. That can be part of your personal story, but I need to hear how you felt, how you dealt with the situation. I've heard personal stories that don't use the word I, the words I, me, or my. That's not a personal story. That's a story you're telling about somebody else. It needs to be about you, as well as about the broader family dynamic that you're engaged with, okay? And the 5-minute story challenge, just to round out this piece. We can't emphasize this enough. Your story needs to be focused. I told you in some cases you have 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. It needs to be focused. All of the details in the descriptions need to illustrate your issue and lead to your one ask. Again, Joanne will talk about that ask in more detail. Making sure your story is always on topic and relevant can be a challenge. It can be a real challenge, even when you've got a short time. So we suggest that you take what you see on the screen here, the 5-minute story challenge. If you can convey your personal story, this would be an entire personal story, in 5 minutes, or if you can't convey it, in 5 minutes, then ask yourself these questions and try to make the changes to narrow it down and bring it into the focus that it needs to have. You should know, though, that based on our experience, including my own experience, you don't get this right the first time. You have to keep working and keep working and keep narrowing it down. Because the reality is that in most cases, we deal with extremes. When I tell somebody, could you please draft your personal story, they either send me 1 paragraph or 25 pages. 25 pages I can work with. 1 paragraph? Were you just born? I mean, I need more than 1 paragraph. I need surely more. Surely your life has been more than 1 paragraph. So more is better, but then you take that more and you narrow it down. And this is a way to help you do that by taking this challenge. Okay, let me move to the second cornerstone piece, and that is relationships. As it says on the slide, at the heart of effective advocacy is impeccable relationships with people in government or other relevant institutions, depending on to whom you're advocating. And you need to remember that it often takes time to build those relationships and to achieve the results that you need. And so you need to invest in these relationships. And again, in the fuller presentation, we go through in quite a bit of detail how you do that. So if you're trying to establish a relationship with an elected official or somebody else, we show you how you do that as you walk through it. But the truth is, particularly when you're advocating to government, if you cast the net widely enough, someone will know someone who knows the decision maker that you need to get to. We live, from a governance perspective or government perspective, in a very small country. There's not a lot of people, and it's spread out, but it's not a lot of people. And because of the small population and because of the nature of the way government is structured in this country, power is very concentrated. It's extremely concentrated. And so you're actually never that far from people who can make decisions that can impact you and your family. You just need to figure out, and we help people do this, who these people are, and then go out and build those relationships and make those connections. But one of the things that I also feel compelled to mention to you as we talk about this today is that many people who do this work, who start to do this work are very hesitant, in part because they may have never done it before, but also in part because it doesn't feel natural. It feels very strange to do advocacy, particularly to government. It can feel very intimidating to advocate to government. And I'm telling you that you're meant to feel that way. It's by design. And I'm not a conspiracy nut, but what I'm telling you is governments want you to feel uncomfortable and to give up and go home. Because if we all participated in our democracy, it would crumble. It's not set up for mass public participation. It's set up for most of us to vote, and that's about it. It's not set up for tremendous public engagement. And so the point I'm making is, as you start to do this work, as you take a step forward and you feel, I shouldn't be here. I feel very uncomfortable. I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can make a difference. Yeah, that's how you're supposed to feel. That's exactly how you're supposed to feel. But my suggestion is just keep going. Just take a second step and a third step. Because the truth is, 99% of the people who are next to you will be gone because they'll give up. And when they go home and you're the only one left, they got to deal with you eventually because you're the only one left. And this is very much how advocacy works, particularly when you're advocating to government. When you have no relationships, it's never too early to start building relationships with decision makers. The theme here being that you build a relationship before you need help. You build a connection before you need somebody to do something for you. You don't walk in and say, hi, I'd like to introduce myself. I need you to do this for me. It's better to build a relationship and then ask for something. It's all about making that first connection, and ultimately those connections, those connection points, will be the stepping stones to leading to what will become a relationship, a solid working relationship with this decision maker. Don't miss a chance to communicate, and don't stop communicating. You need to constantly be connecting with people because you don't know who knows who, and that's often how we come to be able to do this work, because we make these connections, sort of thing. Okay. Just a couple more slides, then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Joanne. Developing an effective advocacy plan and the 5-step process that we want to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk about the first two components, and then Joanne will take it from there. Now that we've discussed the fundamentals of good advocacy, personal story, and relationships, we want to walk you through this 5-step process that either you as individuals or as a group can start to do right away to create an actual advocacy plan or a strategy that you can implement in support of your issues. It's very practical, so we're finished with sort of the theory of advocacy, and it doesn't require substantial resources. But it does require a few things that I think are important to mention to you. Number one, this takes time. It takes time to make change. You can't change the world by devoting 5 minutes a year to your cause. It won't work. It takes time to make change. It takes a commitment. A commitment is a conversation that you have with yourself or amongst a group of you where you say, look, we are committed to making this change. We're not going to stop until this change has been made. And then finally, a willingness to start and stick with it. Starting's easy. That's not a problem. It's sticking with it. It's sticking with it day in and day out in the face of tremendous challenges, because this is something that you need to ensure happens. And it can be really challenging. It's the most challenging part of advocacy, is getting up every day and just continuing to do the work. But I already told you, you kind of have to, because if you stop, nothing will happen. So you have to sort of keep going. And when I say you, please understand what I mean. I mean you in the collective sense of whatever your campaign represents. I don't say you as an individual or that sort of thing. You need to decide how big the network needs to be. You need to decide what resources you need to have, but you as this collective effort need to keep going. So, first step. You want to ask yourself, so let me just preface this by saying these first two steps I'm going to go through with you today are premised on the fact that you are starting from scratch, from sort of ground zero, and you're building up from there. First thing you want to do is ask yourself an initial question. What are the problems, concerns, or challenges, again, as it says, that we faced individually or as a group? If life was perfect, we wouldn't have to do advocacy. So what are the challenges, problems, concerns that you as an individual, as a family, as a group are facing? So you got to write them down. As it says, you want to articulate an answer to those questions. Now, not all issues lend themselves to advocacy. You could have an issue, but it can't be resolved through advocacy. Doesn't mean it's not an issue. It just means we can't use advocacy to solve it or resolve it or face it. And so we talk about this idea of a test. Can the objective be achieved through advocacy? So the thing that you're trying to change, can it be achieved through advocacy? And can a target be identified? There are also certain circumstances where you can identify an issue. It can be resolved through advocacy, but you can't identify the target, the person who can make the change that you need. Well, if you can't identify the person who can make the change, who are you going to advocate to? There's nobody to advocate to. It's rare that this happens. I just want to make it clear, though, that as you're going through this process, you need to ask yourself these questions, because the last thing you want to do is build this campaign, get out there, and you don't know who to advocate to. And then step number 2, the key in the second step is to be able to narrow down complex issues so that they are manageable, or what we call consumable, from an advocacy perspective. Most of the work we do is in healthcare. Healthcare is complex. It's complicated. You need to narrow down the focus of what it is that you're going to advocate for. So as it says there, framing, what aspect of the identified issues do you want to focus on initially? It doesn't mean you won't get to the rest of it, but these got to be bite-sized pieces. And then which of the framed issues are you going to advocate for first? Because we always recommend you pick one issue and you go forward with it. Most organizations, at least initially, do not have the capacity or the resources to be able to carry on 3 or 4 or 5 advocacy campaigns all at the same time. So you need to pick one, ideally, you need to pick one and be able to move forward with it. So let me hand it over to Joanne to take us through the balance of the presentation.
Thanks, Ryan. So the next step, as you can see, is key message development. So maybe just think about this for a minute. When have you been in a meeting or a family discussion where you sort of prepared by jotting down a couple of things that you wanted to talk about? Has anyone ever done that, just to make sure that you're focused, in that meeting or in that discussion? I'm seeing some people nodding their heads. Okay, those were your key messages. You were going through this exact exercise. And because in advocacy, we're talking typically to politicians and sometimes the media, a reporter, most of whom tend to know a little bit about a lot of different things. Okay, they're not experts on many things. It's just the virtue of the nature of their jobs, unless they're a health beat reporter, for example, or the Minister of Health, if you happen to be fortunate to be in front of them. So that situation requires you to simplify as much as possible the information that you're sharing with them. Okay, but that doesn't mean to dumb it down. Like, that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is we want you to think about conveying the core elements of your issue in a compact manner. And that's why we develop key messages as the foundation exercise in any advocacy that we do. And anyone who's worked with us before knows that we spend a lot of time doing this, and often we'll do it as a group collectively on behalf of an entire community so that everyone is able to, sing from the same song sheet. So in a nutshell, what we're asking you to do in developing your key messages is to take an array of information and distill it down to its simplest form, a similar exercise to what you did when you're identifying your issue, and importantly, separating fact from fiction. So you probably can imagine what we're talking about here. Ryan discussed your personal story. That's the fact part of this, right? A politician doesn't want to hear a story that isn't real, that isn't real life. They want to hear exactly what you're going through. Same with the media. Okay, so that's an important distinction. And then when you're advocating on behalf of a group, as I just said before, being able to come to a consensus, and have the same messages that you're all able to share at the same time, the impact will be even more significant. Okay. So, the first step to developing your key messages is framing them. And at the end of your process, your key messages should really tell a self-contained story. And so in a way, you're taking your personal story that you've developed that could be quite lengthy and really distilling it down to these 3 key messages that are common across all the individuals who are participating in a campaign with you. But your messages will be somewhat unique to your situation, to your circumstances, and they may evolve over time. So as your story evolves, as your experience dealing with government evolves, you will possibly be changing your key messages, and so that's important. They're not static. What we stress is that when we develop key messages anyway, we like to develop them in 3s. It's just an easy number. People remember things that come in 3s, and if you try and deliver more than 3 key messages, you might find that people just aren't retaining anything. So that's a little, a tactic that we use. Also, we suggest that they're less than 25 words each, which is extremely difficult, but it's a good sort of, benchmark to try and attain. And importantly, we suggest applying what we call the 4 C's rule to the development of your messages. They should be clear, compelling, concise, and consistent. If you can achieve that, then you're golden. You've got some really solid key messages that are going to really resonate. And it's also really important to practice delivering your key messages. So this might sound funny, but if you have a mirror in your house that you can stand in front of and just practice delivering them, you'll feel really confident when it comes to actually meeting with an elected official. Or find somebody in your neighborhood or in your circle who doesn't know your story very well, that you can practice on. Because if they're understanding and listening and absorbing your key messages, then you know that you've succeeded in developing them well, because they'll be sort of similar to that elected official who you're going to be talking to. And at this stage, when messages, you're going to be thinking about that one ask that Ryan mentioned. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the next few slides, but it's going to be, the ask will be incorporated into your key messages. So here's a model that we use to develop key messages when we work with groups like yours. There are many models, many different approaches to key message development, and in fact, we have used different ones over the course of our careers, but this is one that we think makes a lot of sense and makes it really easy to develop. So in a nutshell, you're going to have 3 messages. One is going to articulate the problem, with respect to your issue. What is the issue and what needs to be addressed? What's wrong? What needs to change? And we call the problem the hook. Okay, and so if you have an elected official, you're trying to get their attention, you've got a reporter who's busy, you're trying to get their attention. If you don't clearly articulate the problem, they're going to be like, yeah, thanks, see you later, right? They're not going to care about what you have to say. And so you have to really clearly explain to them, yes, we have an issue, and you can help. And by the way, here's how you can help. That's your solution, message number 2. Okay, so what can be done that will change the issue, make it better, solve the problem? And that's when we talk, especially in context of media with reporters, the solution message really is what makes the story newsworthy for them. Because, okay, they understand there's a problem, but if you're able to say, and guess what, there's a way that this can be solved, then the reporter is going to be like, oh yeah, okay, let's keep talking about this because clearly something could be done. Let's figure out who can do it and help you to get that problem solved. And then finally, the call to action. This is probably the most important message because after explaining the problem, talking about the solution, if you're not able to articulate what you need someone to do, then your messages are going to fall flat, okay? So this is critical. You really need to be able to say in very clear terms what it is that you need your decision maker or your target to do. Don't be afraid to do this. You need to ask for what you need to happen, okay? That's really, really important. So that leads us to your one ask. We say one because you are going to ask for what you need, not a list of what you want. So this is not your birthday. You're not developing a long list of all the gifts that you want to receive from your family and friends. Okay, this is your singular ask of government. And it's especially important when you're advocating to government because if you ask for everything, as Ryan said, you'll get nothing, okay? That will just overwhelm anybody who you're asking, you're approaching, and they will just not be able to deal with any of it, okay? Or maybe you'll get the thing that's easiest for them to give you, but it won't be the most important thing that you want. So it's really, really critical that you sort of distill it down to your one ask. And that requires you to make choices, as a community, as an individual, and you go through that process, just like you do when you're deciding which issue you're going to be advocating for. Build your ask into your call to action message. And that way, you'll make sure that you deliver it, right? So if it's one of your messages, if it's in one of your messages, you'll say it, you'll get it out there, and you'll repeat it many, many times, because that's the other thing we don't have time to talk about. But key messages, you use them at every opportunity. Every time you have a chance to tell your story, you deliver those key messages. Even if you feel like you're sounding like a broken record, that's okay, because eventually it's going to stick, people are going to remember, and then hopefully they're going to give you what you need. And the other thing that we wanted to say is that your ask needs to be tangible. And I think Ryan probably is best at explaining why this is important just from his experience working in government. If you ask for something that people can't actually give you, then they're going to react in a way that you're not going to be happy with, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it needs to be a thing. So people would often come in and they'd say, "We want your support." And I'd say, "Sure. Are we done? You got my support." Because it's not a thing. It's not real. You can't have a cup of support. You can't have a plate of help. Help, support, commitment. These are all words that politicians make a living at, and they don't mean anything. So you have to ask for something real, something tangible.
Right, exactly. Okay, sounds good. So just moving on then to the fifth step and last step of our process in developing your advocacy strategy. We have a little formula for you, and this is really part of how you're going to use your advocacy tools. Okay, advocacy tools are the last piece. They're really critical to develop. There's many, many tools at your disposal, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But basically, advocacy tools is really anything that you have or produce that may be used to help you to communicate to people. Okay, it's a potential tool. And in our experience with advocacy, every time we work with a new group of people, it's so exciting because they'll inevitably come up with a new tool, a new idea for a tool, because there's no limitations to what you can use as a tool to communicate your messages. And especially in this day and age, we have so many different sort of creative ways to develop information and to communicate information. And really the sky's the limit. And so never think that there's a limitation to what type of tool would be important for you. And really regardless of the issue, it's important to go through this three-step process, at least in our experience. Because then you're going to make sure that you're going to be effective in the way that you use your tools. And so what we say is step one is educating, okay, about your issue. Step two is demonstrating through your personal story why this issue is important and people need to care about it. And then step three, you get to the point where you're actually able to advocate because you've done step 1 and step 2. So the example that I like to think about in my own mind that actually helped me clarify this process is, I have 2 kids, 2 boys, and they want lots of stuff. And one day, they came to me and they were like, "Hey, there's this new game. It just came out. We have to have it." And so they're like, "Okay, you have a million games. Why do you need to have this particular game?" And so, they were sort of like, "Okay, fine." And they went away. They came back and they asked me again, "Mom, we need this game." Okay, I was like, "Okay." Still no, but if you have something else you can say to help me understand why you need it, then go ahead, you tell me. And so they were smart. They went away, they sort of jotted down a few things that they thought would help me to understand why it was important for them to have this game. And they shared that with me, and I was like, okay, I get that. All your friends are playing this game. You want to be part of that, you want to be online with them? Cool. I mean, that makes sense to me because it was something they were doing socially with their friends. And they had a few other reasons as well, which maybe weren't as, compelling. But it worked, So they educated me about the game. It was a game that was okay. I felt comfortable with them playing. They explained to me why it was important in their life to play that game, right? And then they advocated. They delivered their ask, and they got the game. So maybe I'm a bit of a suck, but it worked. It's a process that works, and it'll ultimately get you a better outcome, I think, if you follow that. So, advocacy tools. There are so many, as we said. Really, it's limitless. And so this is just a little list of some of the tools that we use pretty much on a regular basis, that you can certainly incorporate in the work that you do. Some of them are really simple and, free, like a telephone call. Pick up the phone, call your, local MPP, their constituency office in your neighborhood, ask them, for what you need, if you can have a meeting, that kind of thing. A meeting, then, is another advocacy tool. So there's many of them. You can have a brochure, some information about the disease that you're dealing with. You can develop a news release or clinical studies that might help, convince a decision maker about what you're asking if it has to do with medication. Position papers, white papers, and actually Nicola from Stanford Duchenne is going to talk about a white paper that's actually in development right now that this community, I think, will be able to benefit from using as an advocacy tool. So many, many different tools, and importantly, they really can be used at different times to be effective. So let's talk a minute about how to use these advocacy tools. Once you're clear on who your target is, you really need to then think about what the best tools are to use with that target. And so it's important not to just you'll be tempted to throw all of these tools at your decision maker, right away at the beginning. That's not going to work, obviously. It's important to sort of think about which tools you think your decision maker is going to be the most receptive to and the most responsive to, okay? And those are 2 different things. So basically, how best to reach your decision maker in a way that they're comfortable communicating, but also, and it might be a different tool, the way that they're going to be able to respond to you best. So, for example, politicians live on Twitter. We all know that, right? So that's a way to get your message to them. They'll see it, right? They're going to be aware of it, but are they necessarily going to respond to you through Twitter? Probably not, unless there are certain politicians who can't help themselves, right? But they may not, so you might have to pick another tool after you've tweeted at them, to get them to respond to you. Maybe something more direct, less public. Okay, so there's a process. We have to think about which tools we're going to use, who we're targeting, and all of the things that sort of go around that. Some tools are going to have 0 impact on your decision maker. Okay, and you just have to sort of think that through before you use. Otherwise, it's going to be a waste of time. And the other thing too is that you're going to use, as an individual advocating, you're going to use different tools that you're not maybe necessarily going to want your supporters to use because you won't have as much control over the message, okay? You've got your message, you know what you want to say, and so you'll pick a tool to use that is going to help you communicate that message. But for your supporters who aren't as confident it's not their story, you're going to want to give them a different tool that's going to have your messages embedded in it, that's going to allow them to deliver those messages really effectively without messing them up. Okay, so that's all we're saying there. And there's also something to say about timing. So when you use which messages, but we're going to talk a little bit about that, I think, on the next few slides. So timing is important. Basically what we recommend, and you'll see it in a minute, is using a layering effect when it comes to delivering your advocacy tools. Really, there's no set order, but ultimately you're going to want to create this layering effect so that you can use your tools over time, and that's going to take some planning. Okay, so this is all very granular, but when it comes to sort of building your advocacy plan, you are going to want to kind of map it out. Which tool am I going to use when? And there's going to be a progression. And importantly, and we're going to say this again in a few other instances, you need to give your decision maker time to react, to respond. Okay, so you use one tool, you let that kind of resonate for as long as you think is appropriate, and then if you don't hear from them, you use another tool. Okay, or if you get the answer that you don't necessarily want, you use another tool that's going to be a little bit more impactful. Okay, so all of this goes into the decision-making process of which tools, how, and when. And here's just an example of how we talk about layering. So if you look at it from the perspective of the first layer, these are tools that really can be used earlier in your campaign, really at the very beginning. Or even more than once in some cases, right? You'll see that some of these things reoccur, like meetings. You're going to be having meetings probably all the way through your advocacy campaign, but that's a really important place to start. And you're also going to, timing is going to depend on what your objective is of your advocacy. So all of this is a little bit enigmatic at this point because you don't really have a plan in front of you, but it will make sense as you go through. So the first layer, you're going to do things like letters, phone calls, meetings, events, if they're for awareness. Like if you're trying to sort of educate and inform your targets, but you're not really asking them for anything yet, you can certainly do an event in the first stage, but really you're using tools that are more personal, that are more direct in this first layer. And then you're going to move on to the second layer. You're starting to amplify your message a little bit more, bring it into the public domain, okay? And then you're going to start using things like e-advocacy, which we'll talk about, all the great online tools, interactive tools that we have at our disposal. We're going to start getting into media, perhaps, like traditional media, social media, which is part of e-advocacy. You can have another event, let's say, but at this point, that event's going to really start to take an action approach. You're going to start to ask, for what it is that you want. You're sort of done educating, and you're really at the point where you're going to start to advocate. And then you move on to the third layer, and you've got things, again, e-advocacy continues to be important, meetings continue to be important, but then you can start doing other sort of more tangible exercises like postcards and petitions. You're going to hear about a petition that I think the Duchenne community is going to start very soon, a little bit later today. Social media continues to be really important, and then events take a much more assertive, stance when you get to the third layer. So not all the tools are included on this slide, as I mentioned, but those are a number of the ones that we use. So we only have a little bit of time left, so we're going to talk about two particular tools that we find most advocates will use. They'll be part of most campaigns. And the first one is media. So has anybody in this room, and I can see a few people already, been interviewed before? And it doesn't have to be for your disease, anything. Yeah? Okay. Great. So there's definitely a few people who have been through that process. So it can be a little bit stressful sometimes, being interviewed. But the great thing is about advocacy is if you, as Ryan was saying, this is your story. It's unassailable, and you'll find that the media is going to be very, very sympathetic, to your situation, and they are going to become an advocate alongside you. That's how we almost always find, these things go, which is great. So in advocacy, traditional and social media can really be an excellent conduit to sharing your key messages. So if you do an interview, if you say nothing else in that interview, if you deliver your 3 key messages, you're golden, okay? That means you did a successful interview, and hopefully it's going to show up in the way that you want it to be. It's going to really help you to amplify your voice. Social media can be a really simple way to expose people who care about you to your issue, but also to elected officials. So with social media, you have the double sort of benefit of helping to extend your message, through your network, but also directly to your decision maker. So what ends up happening is, where a meeting would be a one-to-one discussion with your decision maker, media, any form of media, ends up becoming one-to-one to many. So all of a sudden, that private discussion that you had with your elected official behind closed doors that nobody else knows about, everyone is aware of it, okay? Your supporters, the public, and then you find that you build your base of support, through that exposure to your issue. So it can be very, very powerful to make a private issue public, and really put that power behind your messaging to bring about change. But it's important to be aware of which channels are going to influence your decision makers, which we talked about already. So the thing that I wanted to sort of stress when it comes to media is that you have to make sure that you go to the right media at the right time in the right way. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about when to go to media in a minute. But what I can tell you about is basically an example today. This event was interesting to London media because the event is here in London. Jesse's Journey is based in London. A number of families live here. So the community media in London took an interest in this event. A little bit trickier to get a national reporter or like an Ontario sort of based reporter interested in your issue. So depending on how you position your story, it can have a community-based focus with respect to a reporter, or it can have a broader focus nationally. So that is just a little bit about thinking about how you're, who you're going to reach out to. So it's always great to start with media in your community when you're telling your story. Okay. So the other piece that I wanted to stress with respect to media is that you have to decide when you're going to go to the media. Okay, so the timing is important. Again, it's critical to let your decision maker help you, give them the chance to help you. So we say the only time that you would go to media first before you talk to your decision maker, there's two instances when you would do that. One, if you're trying to raise awareness or educate, absolutely fine. Go to the media, tell your story, talk about the disease and the challenges that you're facing. Number two, if there's an urgent issue that you need help with right away, it can't wait. And so in that case, typically what you would do is you would go to the media and you would go to your elected official almost simultaneously because you don't have time to mess around. You just got to get this out there, okay? So that's sort of like a little bit of a process sort of perspective for you, but really important to give the decision maker the chance to help. And if the person who you're advocating to isn't ultimately the decision maker. So if you're going to your local MPP, for example, but they're not the one that's going to make the decision, perhaps it'll be the health minister or somebody in their office, you can ask your elected official if they would be interested in joining you at an interview. They might be very happy to stand beside you and be interviewed by a reporter as well, because it'll give them a chance to show that they're supporting one of their constituents. So that's something to consider when you're doing your work. And also, you may not know anybody in the media, but people in your network might. So that's another thing to think about is there anybody who you know that has connections to a reporter, that you want to sort of tap into. So that's just a little bit about media, but we do a whole separate section, from a training perspective on working with the media. So lastly, the tool that we wanted to talk about at the end is just e-advocacy. And this is going to be something that I think you're going to see as a community pop up as a resource and a tool for you to use in the coming weeks and months and, as we move forward in the advocacy work that we're supporting. But it's important to note that in the past, advocacy was really limited to these real world encounters and tangible activities, things that we did in real life, walking down the street, going to a meeting, going to a barbecue, meeting a politician, that kind of thing. But today, the internet has really opened up endless channels for us to advocate and really making it possible to engage more people in our work than ever before. It's become so simple for us to build that network around us, and your organizations that you're all a part of are doing that so effectively. Also important to note that e-advocacy is a spectrum of activities. It's not one activity. Or action, and those activities vary in their time commitment and their level of difficulty. And so what we find is that it's very simple to engage our network in passive, e-advocacy actions. Okay, so liking a post on Facebook, even commenting, retweeting something that we put out. Those are passive. They're quick. They show instant support, but they're great from a volume perspective, but they're not necessarily as effective as the more active engagement that we can tend to take in the real world, okay? Or even online, and that's harder, it's slower, it takes more time, but it really is the key to effective advocacy. So, for example, in the e-advocacy hub that soon will be, I think, part of this community, you'll have an opportunity to send a letter, to send an email to an elected official. And as part of that letter, you'll have an opportunity to personalize it, okay? So doing something like that has significantly more impact than just liking a post or sharing a post, right? And so that's what I mean by a spectrum of activities, and that'll become clear as you see more and more. And so we do want to convert that passive engagement to active engagement as we go along in our advocacy strategy, because it really still is the holy grail, getting people to actually walk down the street and do something. So really, there are so many different tools, as we've talked about, in channels that you can use in e-advocacy. And there's a few listed here: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We know them all, right? We use them every day. But you do want to consider your audience, which we've discussed, and in terms of impact, but also shareability. So in the beginning of your campaign, the more easily shareable your content is, the better, right? That's what you want to focus on, just getting it out there to everybody you possibly can, so then they can share it, and you build this groundswell of activity. And also important to note that you can use the advocacy along the path of your advocacy work just by again and again, just by changing your messaging. Okay, so think about that too. That it's not going to be static. Things are going to evolve. Your messaging is going to change, and that just allows you to keep reusing these tools over and over again, but just punching up your messaging at every stage of the work that you're doing. And that's it. That's a lot in a very condensed period of time. So apologies if we rushed through a little bit, but we thank you so much. And happy to take some questions. I think we have a few minutes. Yay, we have 10 minutes. But we also just wanted to say that we're going to be here, as Ryan mentioned, throughout the day. So if you have any questions, please come on up. We'd love to chat with you in more depth. And also, if you're interested in being kept informed about the advocacy work that the Duchenne community is going to be doing or continuing to do, or if you want to talk about what it means to be an advocate, just let any of the Jesse's Journey folks know. Just give them your name and your email address and let them know that you're interested in advocacy, and we'll be happy to sort of work with you as we move forward. So, yeah, anybody have any questions that they're, I know that was a long session, you're probably just looking forward to getting up and moving, but. Yeah?
Do we have any questions? Yeah. Let me just.
Is the presentation available online? Or?
Yes, we will have all of the slides available for you, with one or two possible exceptions for confidentiality because of research work that's going on. And the entire session today is being taped as well. So we will have the entire session available for you afterwards online. Yeah, Frank.
What do you think is the impact of advocacy with a person who actually has, for example, a disability doing advocacy versus?
So the person who's directly impacted being the advocate, is that your question, or yeah?
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, sure, of course. So yeah, the question was, what is the impact of the person who is directly impacted by the disease, I'm going to use the word patient for lack of a better term, being an advocate, I suppose, as opposed to a family member or somebody like that. Okay, so the answer is both. The answer is always both or more than one. When we do advocacy, it's critically important to hear directly from, again, what I'll call the patient. But it's also critically important to hear from family members, caregivers, other supporters, and clinicians as well. It's also important to hear from clinicians too, because depending on the person that you're advocating to, it may be necessary to have a somewhat clinical discussion, for example. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier. There's no question in my mind that everybody in this room is an expert in Duchenne. The problem is, and I'll be very blunt with you, when you go and advocate to government, particularly bureaucrats and other people like that, if you don't have MD or PhD after your name, it doesn't matter how much you know, you're not going to be taken with the same level of, you're not going to be given the same level of courtesy and respect when it comes to the clinical components as somebody who is an MD or a PhD. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just telling you the reality of what you're going to face. So what you want to do in all of your advocacy efforts is make sure that the person to whom you're advocating is being presented with a personal story and all of the advocacy components from a number of different angles, including people who they are going to respect and note that they're talking about something that they're, if you will, qualified to talk about. Again, not passing judgment on whether it's right or wrong, I'm just telling you that's what you're going to face. I have been in meetings where families have started to talk about the clinical components of an issue, and very rudely, a bureaucrat has said, "Oh, are you a doctor?" And they say, "Well, no, I'm not a doctor, but we've lived with this for 25 years. Well, you're not a doctor, so I can't imagine that you really have an understanding of this from a clinical perspective." Now, that's disrespectful, but it happens. But if you have a clinician with you, then she can very easily pipe in and say, "Well, I'm a physician, and I'm happy to support what that person just said." They know what they're talking about, that kind of thing. So, yes, the more people who can articulate and advocate from different perspectives, the better.
Anybody else? Question, I can bring the mic over to you if you want to ask it. No?
I just want to say a couple things. First of all, I want to thank, and this is not necessarily drawing this session to a close, but I want to thank very, very much Joanne and also Ryan for their time this morning. And we took an hour this morning on something called advocacy. Why? Because now treatments and drugs are finally coming available for the boys. We don't have a system in this country that is efficient. We don't have a system in this country that is welcoming to pharmaceutical companies who are bringing the drugs. We do not have a system that is sympathetic to the rare disease world or to Duchenne. And that's a rather blunt, but that's pretty much what the situation is. And so this is what we're encountering. My role, I'm Rick Moss, by the way, with Jesse's Journey. My role is advocacy. These people have done great work, the guidance. The importance of this session this morning, I can't stress enough, because we are going to be in touch with you. We are going to be asking you to be a voice for advocacy when that next drug arrives, when that next treatment arrives. Canada, unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, we only represent 2%, because we're relatively small, of the pharmaceutical world. So how do we even get the pharmaceuticals' attention to come to this country? So this is why we must continue to advocate and stress that to our bureaucrats, to the politicians, to anyone who will listen, because we need to bring this and put it on the radar. Fortunately, the federal government, although they have delayed the actual action that they're going to take to 2022, they have put rare disease, of which Duchenne is one, on the radar. We're going to chase that. We're going to chase it hard. We're not going to let go. But we need all of your voices to be loud and clear when we ask for your support to make things happen. Ryan, Joanne made a perfectly clear point. How do we become that file that is on the top of those 100? That's our goal. We are not going to be file 99 or 100 that never gets looked at. We're going to be noisy. We're going to be very vocal about what it is we want to achieve. So the messaging these people are going to help us with for our own organization. And so you will be hearing more from us, and you'll be hearing from Joanne and Ryan just very briefly this afternoon on some hard, actionable tools that are going to be available.